Some combination of cultural activism and hard capitalism should deliver us a relatively utopian technical fix for the old world problem. We could make sure that none of the poorest die of preventable disease. We could make sure that none of the poorest die of starvation. We could raise the floor of humanity to a level that nobody would fall below with far less effort than we could make even small changes to fundamental economic inequality. So my preference is that the progressive cause is reframed as we fix the living conditions of the poorest and we let the rest of them get on with it. I think equality is a total red herring.
For episode 43, my guest is Vinay Gupta, a Renaissance man and futurist interested in the technological transformation of society and commerce. He is the CEO of Materium, which TechCrunch recently named as perhaps the world's weirdest and most daring startup. In this conversation, which took place in London this summer, we discussed blockchain, the myths we live in, and where the real opportunity for destruction of the old world lies. This brings about interesting questions of how we can hide in our spirituality, belief systems, and cultural identities, and what happens if we move beyond what Vinay calls hippie good vibe activism. I want to say a thank you to some of our newest patrons, Nikki French-Blake, Ben Carter, Sam Struthers, and Alicia Naples. Your support means so much to us. And if you want to join me in India in the new year, I have 2 immersions coming up in January and March. You can find the details on www.amisha.co.uk. I hope that you enjoy this conversation and it opens up possibility in you. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I am delighted today to be joined by Vinay Gupta. Welcome to the show, Vinay, and thank you for hosting me here in your home.
Oh, I'm glad to be here with you. I think it'll be an interesting chat.
Let's dive right in. We have talked a bit about blockchain on the show before, but I feel like blockchain is something that you have to hear, or some of us have to hear multiple times before we really understand what it is and what the opportunity is.
Blockchain is basically the next generation of internet technology. The last fundamental change in the structure of the internet was when we put credit cards online in the late 1990s. This was the whole e-commerce revolution, where we took a tiny little bit of cryptography, the thinnest possible slice of cryptography, and that gave us the padlocks on websites that let you send money over the internet. So before that, there was no commercial internet because you couldn't take payments. There were no adverts because people wouldn't buy anything. The whole thing was basically an academic exercise. It was very popular and it was very interesting. Then you took this tiny sliver of cryptography and you could just get a single financial instrument online, which was the credit card payment. And from this comes the entire internet ecology that we currently have. So the blockchain is going back to the cryptographers and saying, what else do you have? Well, how's about global electronic cash system? How's about supply chain tracking? How's about invoices? And they want, all of these things. You build the cryptography that can represent those things instead of just doing credit card payments. Now you can do all the rest of the financial instruments, and the whole thing opens up again in an enormous way.
Okay, and so there's a lot of hype around what that means. Can you enlighten us a little bit on where that opportunity is?
I have some friends at a company called Sweetbridge, and Scott Nelson, their CEO, explains it like this. Right now, basically the business-to-business payment market, the invoices, is on the order of 50 trillion a year. Right? Consumer spending over the internet is on the order of 1 or 2 trillion a year. So the thing which is next door to where we are is 25 times or 20 times the size of the current internet market. Because right now, all the business-to-business payments are not being made online. right? There is no, Amazon for, heavy trucking. None of that stuff is really there because the payment mechanisms, the accountability, the track and trace, and all the rest of that stuff don't really fit inside of the current generation of internet technology, because the only payment instruments we have are credit cards, and real businesses don't do that kind of stuff on credit cards. They just don't have the right affordances. So you bring in a new generation of payment instruments that do fit for that market, and you can basically begin the internetization of the entire business-to-business economy, which is 20 times the size of the consumer economy. It's not going to be small. And if you think about it, think of how difficult and manual everything to do with invoicing is. Right? It's the same in big companies. It's not like it magically becomes better past some level. In fact, it actually becomes worse. It's more and more complicated, more and more bureaucratic, more and more humans in the loop as you have to get auditors and rekey things and reconcile books and all the rest of that stuff. All the underlying computer systems are 30 years old and they're terrible. And we're just connecting these terrible old non-functional computer systems by putting more and more people in the loop to manually rekey stuff. It is disastrous.
Most of it's still happening with spreadsheets and emails, invoices.
All of that. So you go through with a set of new payment instruments and you automate the entire thing end to end. And on the other side of that, you get liberation. And probably a 5% or maybe even 10% jump in global GDP. This is what we're playing for. It makes the current generation of the internet story look like small potatoes. And we've all, in our business lives, seen the pain of ineffective invoicing, problems figuring out where physical goods are, slipshod communication about what will happen and when it will happen. All of that stuff is potentially automatable, but you have to actually do it. And this is what the blockchain revolution, TM, might bring. It's pretty full on.
Can you give us a really easy to understand example of how that will transform business as we know it?
Well, I think, again, this all comes from Sweetbridge, but the crux of it is just that invoicing is horrible. Everything about invoicing as a process is broken. You really want a situation where you type the invoice into your computer and it automatically appears in their computer as the same invoice. And if you make an update to it, their version of it should reflect the update immediately. It should be a single thing which is shared between all the people across all the departments, across all the companies who are all in the business of managing that invoice.
Right, and that when a payment's then made, that automatically updates to say that payment's happened.
And it should be shared state across all the participants in the system, including regulators and tax people. All of that stuff should be a single integrated fabric. Now, getting there is non-trivial. Even with blockchain, getting there is non-trivial. But imagine how much it would take out of the hassle of being alive if all of that stuff just worked as easily as credit card payments online. It's a fundamental process that consumes, a few % of the time of every business in the world. And you just go through and you sensibly automate and life becomes easier, and that turns out to be a huge amount of savings of cost and effort. It's not fundamentally complicated. Getting there is extremely complicated, but the actual there is not that complicated. And there are lots of other versions of this story. You can talk to people about currencies, globalization, regulation, free trade. There are all kinds of other things that people will talk about. But I think just this notion that it's moving the business-to-business payments online in a sensible way, I think that's the simplest, credible version of why this is a big deal.
And for you, this is the focus more than, say, the opportunity for shifting the way that we experience democracy, for example. There's a lot of talk about that in the blockchain story.
Yes. So the story that technology will affect society and make it fundamentally more democratic has been retold by every generation of anarchists since probably Kropotkin or before Kropotkin. OHM 2013, it was a big hacker festival in the Netherlands. Samari McCarthy and Herbert Snorrison, who were members of the Icelandic Pirate Party, gave a talk about the history of classical anarchism and technology. And what they said very clearly, and it amazingly irritates me that all of my recorders were out of batteries. It was the end of a really long day and I just didn't have any recording devices. So we don't have a recording of the talk, which is unfortunate because it was legendary. But what they said was, look, every generation of classical anarchists has looked at the new technology and the disintermediated zone around the new technology and said, look, in this disintermediated zone, we have small-scale community-level freedom. So Kropotkin, it was the electric motor. The electric motor will decentralize agriculture, because you will no longer have to go to the mill to get everything processed. As a result, we'll get an egalitarian society. The electrical motor is the salvation of man, kind of thinking. Turns out in practice this doesn't happen. We mistake the disintermediated, flexible, chaotic zone around new technology for being the potential of the new technology. Right? It's not the potential of the new technology, it's just what rapid rate of change zones look like. So every new technology comes along, it's surrounded by this kind of bubble of freedom and possibility and openness and all the rest of this stuff. And then as soon as the new technology fully matures, it gets completely integrated into the enormous crystalline slab of mainstream society. And then you get a sudden drop in the amount of liberty in the system until the next new technology opens up another zone of exception.
So, for example, when everyone got excited about Facebook and social media and the ability to spread messages, and then before long realised that it's actually being used to watch what you're interested in and sell you things related to where your desires and human drivers are.
Precisely, right? The initial period, the thing is brand sparky new. Everybody that's interested in brand sparky new is just like, ooh, look at that. Wow, it's covered in sparks. This is amazing. Let's go over there. That's really fun. Ooh. So you get this kind of early phase of novelty-seeking chimping. And everybody dances around the new thing like, ooh, look, the future, freedom, freedom, freedom. Because that's what the novelty seekers want. Once it becomes apparent to the rest of society that the novelty seekers have something worth having, the rest of society trump in, and the rest of society has a different set of desires. They want it mainstreamed, they want it regularized, they want it simplified, and they want it to pay. And pretty soon, the new thing is just another thing.
And so that's already happening with blockchain?
The blockchain dream of decentralization died before most people have ever even heard of the name. The actual critical decisions were made about 2013, maybe even a little earlier. So the original vision of Bitcoin, and people will contest this, but I'm pretty comfortable with my position, was that people would largely do the Bitcoin mining at home on their laptops overnight. As a result, Bitcoin would never be a thing that a person bought, it would be a thing that was made at home in craft production. If you had a laptop, you would be of the class of people that could mine Bitcoin at home, and as a result, you'd have a secondary income stream of this kind of internet funny money. What happened was that they figured out there was a more efficient way of making Bitcoin, which was that you designed special silicon chips, which were enormously expensive to set up, but then they would completely outclass the laptop users. As a result, Bitcoin went from being a thing that you made yourself to a thing that you bought. And at that point, the entire profitability of Bitcoin as an enterprise, instead of being distributed across the entire population of users, assuming they had a laptop, went to a relatively concentrated power structure, which is the Bitcoin miners. And these are very, very heavy capitalist elites who raise enormous sums of money to build the next generation of chips to stay ahead of the development curve. And there's a Red Queen race at the front of the Bitcoin process, but there are only maybe half a dozen or a dozen players in that race. And at that point, it turns out that you just have more capitalism.
And then for the rest of us, it's little more than buying shares, kind of coming into the crypto market.
So the original decentralization vision was dead before most people had ever heard of it. And I remember fighting that like hell on the way down. I was in the scene at that point, just like, this is a disaster. This is not the way that we should do this. Boy, howdy, is this going to cause trouble? And it did. And that's an example of this crystallization, ossification process where things go from these zones of exception into being bolted into the real world.
Does that mean that that's all of the potential around transparency, democracy, that all of this is somewhat pretend, somewhat a spectacle?
Well, remember social enterprise, right? Social enterprise 10 years ago was going to fix everything. Social enterprise in practice is almost universally nonsense. There's practically none of it that does any good and pays. Some things pay. Those look almost exactly like businesses, and they're constantly sacrificing their social good agenda for the money. Other things take the other track, and they're basically charities. They don't make any money. They're constantly looking for grants, and they might as well be charities. There are only a tiny handful, like 2 or 3 companies, which successfully combine business and the social agenda in a way which is good for both simultaneously. Almost all of them are making trade-offs. Only a few ever achieved the synthesis. Nearly the entire field is just nonsense. It's bankrupt. And this is very, very, very typical. There's a cyclical process where each generation seizes onto a thing and is like, this is how our generation will make the world a better place. The world is not a better place. right? We're stuck in a loop of optimism where every generation of young optimistic people grab onto something and they build a little cargo cult around it, which is their generational myth. And then by the time they're in their 40s, the ones that savvily played the generational myth are the next generation of the elite, and the ones who didn't are broke.
Okay, let's just take a deep breath with that. Is it still worth having a go and dying trying, or is it pointless to engage in these myths to try and find a way?
You know, as a famous American general once said, nobody ever won a war by dying for their country. You win a war by making some other bastard die for his. Right? So I think that we have gotten into a trap where we think that we can solve the world's problems by creation. And in fact, what is required is not more creation. What is required is extremely precise clinical destruction. We need the old world to die, and we need to kill it. And because we don't have any strong positive rhetoric around destruction, we use phrases like disruption. We are going to disrupt the moribund industry that does such and such. What that really means is we're going to just kill it. Coal-fired power plants. These need to die, right? You might beat them to death with a solar panel, but the basic impulse is, look, this thing is toxic for the whole of humanity. It's toxic for the future. It's wrecking the environment. It's poisoning everything around it. The people that work in it are miserable, and the people that extract the coal are living in terrible conditions. Why would we do this? Kill that. Just get rid of it. And I think that this is, kind of the fallout of the American folk Buddhism in the 1960s, where they took a completely incomplete understanding of Asian culture, latched onto it as if it was the new Christianity, and then that distortion became the default reality for most progressive Westerners. They all live inside of folk Buddhism. They've got values like compassion. It's not a Western value. They don't understand it in the Asian way, and they don't understand it in the traditional Western way. They have this kind of mishmash of terrible ideas, and then they're running around painting this stuff on all the surfaces, assuming that it will make them better people. This doesn't work. You see it a lot in the kind of, South American ayahuasca thing. You see all these little tribes in London of various kinds of ayahuasca. Like, oh yes, we're going off to see such and such and so and so, and we're going to do so and so. And I have no idea of what the locals actually think of these folks, but I have a feeling that it's not very polite. A few of them might be sincere enough that they're making some genuine connection with the old culture and that they're learning something. But the vast majority of them are just using their psychedelic experiences to bolster the myths in which they already live, rather than to strip them and replace them with something which is closer to the actual grain of reality. The folk religion of the Western progressives, I think, is the largest single block that we have towards making real progress on any substantial global issue.
I'm with you, and I'm just feeling into our friends listening, many of them who are deep in this myth, as you describe it, who are looking for a different way to relate to a world that doesn't make sense to them, and have travelled physically or metaphorically into teachings that have provided some comfort and some roadmap. And yet I can hear that that's also perpetuating the story that we're in. So how do we take ourselves out of that? How do we understand if what we have come to believe in is myth or is actually keys to take us somewhere else?
It's all a bit of both. Regardless of what religious tradition you come from or what spirituality you embrace, somewhere between 40 and nearly everything that you know is just nonsense, right? If you look at, my own tradition is Hinduism, there's a whole bunch of totally hilarious nonsense in Hinduism. And if it's understood as being like a Punch and Judy show at the side of the main religion, you do okay. And if you take it seriously, you're in dreadful trouble. The nuance that it takes culturally to know what's the Punch and Judy show and what's the actual main science, this is not an easy thing to acquire, right? I am only half Indian. I grew up in the West. I am sure there are things that I think are true that are just part of the Punch and Judy show that I just, didn't get that great an education. I might be enlightened, but it's not the same thing as being educated, right? I have a Brahmin friend who's just like, Vinay, with all due respect, you know nothing. I'm like, I know. I just fell here. And, that sort of balance, even for the people that are lifelong students, is still there. So I don't think it's realistic to expect the second or third generation of Westerners exposed to Asian religion to have good judgment about it. The first generation, the second generation of people exposed to South American shamanism, I have no idea even what the spectrum is of ideology inside of the shamanic world in South America, right? Are there good ones and bad ones? Are there chaotic ones and orderly ones? Are there, sun worshippers and moon worshippers and jungle worshippers? I just don't even know what the range of, the spectrum of identities is for those people. I couldn't even begin to map it. And what's happening is we're going down there and everybody assumes that it's the same. Like, oh, we went to see a shaman. Yeah, but which kind? Well, I don't know. I didn't know they came in kinds. Well, I don't know that they come in kinds. Maybe they're all identical, but I would be very surprised.
Well, also the mixing of everything together that's happening. So I was just at a gathering where there had been an ayahuasca ceremony just before it. And then, there's people standing offering Native American prayers, offering this. Then there's a group Om. It's all so mixed together.
Yeah. And this is the American folk Buddhism tradition, right? The universal solvent for that stuff is the idea that everybody should be in some way nice, and that if everybody is nice, the world will automatically improve. And that's the absolute bedrock of the mythology. And then they've got a fairly soft notion that there's some kind of individual spiritual development that leads in the long run to some kind of high state of consciousness in which you have a kind of charmed life in the world. Right? Understanding that as the beginnings of an indigenous religious tradition in the West, as a new religious movement would be the typical way of thinking of it, that's extremely diffuse and very variegated, I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. It's not actually Buddhism, it's not quite the New Age, it's matured a little since then. It's got elements of a bunch of things, it's very syncretic, it's done enormous damage, but also enormous amplification of Hatha Yoga. All of that stuff, it's in the bucket. The problem is, and this is the crux of the entire mess in the West, does it constitute a valid spiritual path through which a person can attain self-realization? If the answer is yes, then you feed it, you water it, you try and broaden the path, everything will be fine. If the answer is no, they're all stuck in hell and they're never getting out. Because, as they say in Tibetan Buddhism, right, the best thing to do is not to start, and if you start, the best thing to do is to finish, right? Like a snake going through a bamboo tube, they say. So if all these folks are, snakes that are 3/4 of the way down a bamboo tube and the thing has a blockage, they are righteously screwed. Because if you can't go deep enough into the tradition that you come back to the equanimity of the world has always been here, and we are only small, if you can't get to that place where you can re-accept the universe in a very profound sense, you're just going to wind up torturing yourself with completely impossible moral questions that you get more and more and more awareness of, but you never break past. And that's only one of half a dozen problems that you could get at that level of play. It's an extraordinarily dangerous cultural position, because much of the innovation capital, the human innovation capital, the people that can do the thing in the Western culture have fallen into this incomplete folk tradition. And if they can't get from the incomplete folk tradition to a proper, fully integrated transcendence by their 50s, the moral compromises that you have to make as part of the real world will eventually tear them to pieces. And you see a lot of that. The high-level people inside of these scenes are often enormously burdened by spiritual insights they can't integrate and enormous moral guilt about the condition of the world and their inability to change it. You go to the Asian cultures, the top class of teachers are just like, yep, I never said it was easy, but it's also not our problem. And they're still enormously engaged in the world in many cases, but they're also free of the burden. The kind of Thich Nhat Hanhs of the world, fully engaged, but also fully liberated. And if you can't get the fully liberated with the fully engaged rips you to pieces. We have issues.
Indeed.
So that question about whether or not the kind of American folk Buddhist, or whatever you want to call that tradition, can take people all the way, I don't know how we would answer that. I mean, Ken Wilber certainly gave it a pretty good old try, but I'm not convinced that anybody from Ken Wilber's gang has gone all the way. There are a few other groups out there that have their own kind of isolated pockets of this and that. There's Scientology, which is bizarrely not to be sneezed at. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff out there. But if we don't have a fully matured Western Enlightenment tradition that works, how then are we to carry out the negotiation between Western culture and the rest of the world about the behavior of Western culture? Who are we negotiating with if they have no enlightened leadership?
Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about, you mentioned earlier, the old world and the destruction of the old world that needs to happen. What is that? What is the old world? And why does it need to be destroyed? And I know that this is in many ways obvious, but it helps to bring it into the conversation.
So I'm an engineer, right? At the end of the day, I view global warming as basically 3 or 4 technologies which all completely suck, right? Badly insulated housing, 2-ton heavy metal petrol-breathing cars, beef produced by methane-emitting cows. And those 3 technologies, it's your transport, it's your housing, and it's your food. And they all generate huge amounts of warming, and as a result, the world is warming. Eventually, it will break agriculture as we currently know it, and then very bad things will happen. Legendarily bad things. But things so bad people will talk about them in 1,000 years, bad things will happen.
I'd like to add our clothes into that, because enormous impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know less about that, but certainly, I keep hearing bad noises about fast fashion. And pictures of these, kind of garbage dumps of used clothing that look like aircraft hangars. So yeah, in that context, how much cultural change does it take to get rid of those technologies? If you've got alternate technologies which are much better than these technologies, 0 cultural change is required. The adoption of solar panels that's happening right now started as a cultural movement, and now it's run on pure hard efficiency arguments. Well, we could build a really expensive power plant, or we could build a really cheap one that's much more performant. Well, why don't we do the cheap thing? That seems obvious. So it's over the hump, where the solar revolution is being driven by the fact the solar panel is better than the old world. No cultural change required, but it started as cultural change. The Germans invested an unbelievable amount of money in building a really inefficient solar economy because it drove the global agenda that they wanted, and that was a key part, because my understanding is, it was a key part of what drove the price of solar panels down and built the industrial infrastructure that's currently decarbonizing the electricity industry. In America, I think it was 14 that was the crossing point, it might have been 16. More than 50% of the new electricity generation capacity that was built in the States was renewables. So we're getting close to the point where the only new energy systems which are built are renewable energy systems, and at that point the old stuff just wears out and dies. The coal plants are just like, well, this thing's been in business 28 years, we're going to power it down next year and that'll be the last of them. And then at that point we're free, we're done. Right? Same thing with meat. Getting people off the heavy meat diet is practically impossible. Right? It's just very, very hard. Can you make meat without having cows? Cow-free meat, what they call clean meat, you grow it in, industrial factories like you would with yogurt or cheese. But what comes out is meat with very low carbon emissions. And there's a decent chance that it's going to be very cheap and very good quality because you can design exactly the meat that you want. Right? Eventually, it will probably not even be animal cells. You'll probably just build it from scratch. But initially, it's likely to be a cultured animal protein. So you take a few cells of cow and you just turn it into a river of hamburgers. There are some kind of is that even really food arguments? But I think that if it's any good, it will rapidly displace meat from the ecosystem. And if we get rid of the damn cows, nature grows back, because across most of the world, it will become so economic for human beings to occupy huge parts of nature that nature will just grow back because the people can no longer afford to compete with nature. South America, the thing which is eating the jungles is beef pasture. If all those cows have been replaced with industrial cell culture, the beef pasture goes back to being jungle. And you don't need a set of environmental mandates to do that. The raw economic power drives it. So from my perspective, there's a need for cultural activism when these things are not quite good enough to pass, and the cultural will is to make up the gap. But then once they're good enough, it just rolls out through reality and things move very, very, very quickly. And on most of the worst problems are on that trajectory right now. I'm actually more hopeful about the long-term story than I have ever been in my life, largely because of the solar panel revolution. And I think the replacement of the cow with industrial production that's probably the biggest news of the 21st century if we can crack that, because you finally have a human race which doesn't live by cannibalism of animals, which all the Indians know is a very good idea.
It's still hard to see that one happening.
The money is going in, the technology is there, biotech moves extremely quickly, I suspect it will be an option that people will eat a few times a year within less than 5 years, and I think it could be massively mainstream in 10. I think it will go from sort of, prototype products to really, really everywhere very, very quickly. Because the industrial supply chain, you get to the point where you're buying hamburgers from McDonald's and it arrives in the same truck. You just tick box A or box B. And then hundreds of millions of people are now eating the new product. Mm-hmm. So the switching is, because you've got a lot of central power in the switching, what's in the store in Walmart, what's in the store in McDonald's, what do the big restaurant distributors carry, what does Tesco buy, the switch could be extremely rapid.
And it's questionable how much meat is in some of those products anyway. And so if it's being designed in a meatless but more refined way, then the quality is going up.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could get market-driven transformation of the big three problems. Mm-hmm. Electric cars, clean electricity, clean meat. It's not bad, right? 50 years ago, that would have looked impossibly miraculous. Now, it's pretty close. Some combination of cultural activism and hard capitalism should deliver us a relatively utopian technical fix for the old world problem. And there'll be some fighting and some screaming on the way down, like government of Spain, there's a whole bunch of pressure back against solar panels because they're afraid they'll destabilise the electrical grid. There are issues like that have to be contended with. The old world occasionally kicks back, but it can be put down simply by economic means as long as we have the investment in new technology.
Do we have time for this to play out generally over 10 years?
My estimate is that somewhere around 200 million to 500 million people are going to starve to death in the next 20 years because of climate change. Right? It's kind of a back-of-the-envelope guess. You've got to make some very questionable assumptions about how the agricultural system works. It doesn't include things like you might be able to mass-produce protein in a biotech way. There are lots of questions about how it might work. But I think there is a pretty decent chance that we'll get a big enough drought that it will hiccup agriculture. And if that happens, the poor will go to the wall in enormous numbers, and there'll be a whole bunch of civil war over hunger and the rest of this kind of stuff.
Where do you see these wars and these droughts happening in the world? I mean, is this going to be in London, or are we talking mostly in agricultural nations?
Oh, I mean, the poorest will go to the wall first, right? It could be Africa, it could be South America, it could be Asia, it could be India, it could be everywhere simultaneously. Right? It depends on the nature of the drought, or whatever other condition it might be, right? But the closer you are to the ground, the closer you are to the land, rather than being insulated by the market, the more directly exposed you are to climate change. If you live directly from nature and nature is under attack, you get hit first.
And so then there's an underlying race issue there as well.
Well, I mean, in the world, there is a straight line correlation between skin colour and life expectancy. The darker you are, the less long you live. It's about 25 years. Right? Even in America, there's a straight line graph between skin colour and life expectancy. So you can't get away from that. Right? You plot it on a graph, it's pretty clear what's happening. There's no easy way to deny it, and then there are a forest of different factors that contribute to that problem. Now, what do you do about it? Is there anything that can be done? Yeah. We've gone some way in decolonising some parts of the culture to a limited degree, but nobody really doubts that the world works in the way the world works, and it's going to be that way until something changes. Maybe it will be a slow easing off and things will gradually improve. Maybe there will be a sudden transformative moment of some kind. A lot of people point to Obama in America as being, the break with the tradition. You could also look at Meghan Markle. I mean, you could suggest that the elites are beginning to accept that they're post-racial. And given 3 or 4 generations, that might all ease out. Doing anything about it in a more accelerated way than that, I just don't know what levers you would pull. How do you get hold of a problem that may have roots, it may be genetic to the hundreds of millions of years point that we have a tendency to be hostile to animals that are less genetically similar to us. We may not be able to dig that out of the human being without changing the DNA. Where we've got statistical machinery that can observe racial bias, we ought to be beating it out of our controllable systems. If you're a bank that's making loans, you ought to be able to use software to detect racism and then stop racism inside of your institution because you've got a statistical base to make decisions from. in areas where we don't have a statistical base to make decisions from, where it's not institutions but it's individuals, I think it's vastly harder to make a reasonable guess at how you would stop racism. Institutional racism, where you've got a statistical base and you can measure for it and you can detect it and you can change culture and you can fix it by force if you have to, I think that kind of racism we could effectively stamp out. The kind of racism which is just who does or doesn't get invited to the dinner parties, we're not getting rid of that today, right? And it applies in all directions. I mean, if you're deep in Indian culture, you invited who? It cuts both ways on this stuff. Mm-hmm. So yeah, institutional racism, I think we can fix, we can detect, we can test for it, we can do something. Personal racism, it'd be nice if people were nicer to each other, but it's a big ask.
And that's because it's deep in our DNA?
I think there's a very good chance of it, yeah. I mean, if you think about it across animal species, it's very clear that, things which compete in the same ecosystems are often very hostile to each other. Cats fight, dogs, that kind of stuff. I think there is a decent argument that many species are very, very territorial, and the territories are held by similar genetic groups. Think of, prairie dogs or something like that, right? If you're from tribe A and the other prairie dogs are in tribe B, these two groups of prairie dogs, they just don't mix. They're competitors, they have a territorial boundary, they, make displays when they're holding court, like, no, this is ours, that kind of a thing. Would we expect humans to be free of that just because they grew thumbs? There may be some fundamental genetic tendencies there towards tribalism, towards insularity. There may be some places where we judge people's genetic similarity before we decide how we treat them.
And all of this happens completely unconsciously.
I'm not saying that it is for sure this way, but I think it's a reasonable guess. And you can see similar things around gender. If you do experiments where somebody falls downstairs, the reaction of the people around them is 100% gendered. Almost any fundamental psychology experiment, you have to calibrate for gender because people treat men and women completely differently at a deep instinctive level. And that really shouldn't surprise us because the men have always been expendable and the women have always not been. Right? The size of the next generation is almost unrelated to the number of men you have around. It's almost entirely related to the number of women you have around. So in almost any group, if there's an incoming danger, the men are instinctively thrown into the line of fire first to protect the women and children. Are we going to change that anytime soon? It seems unlikely, and it's probably not even a good idea. So with responses and reflexes at that depth, should we be that surprised? I don't think we should be surprised at all.
Yeah, it's interesting feeling into what that brings up for me on a kind of personal level of how growing up brown, obviously, but in a very, very, very white surrounding, often being the only brown person in most rooms that I've been in. What subtly is interplaying underneath throughout that.
It's very, very, very tricky to imagine a world in which we were blind to gender to the level where in the event of a fire or a flood or a war, the women would run towards the danger at the same rate that the men did. Right? It'd be interesting to see how that's working in Israel. They've got a lot of women in uniform, they've got a lot of women that are trained to fight. It may be that in that cultural context, they've largely overcome those reflexes and they're much more socially conditioned than genetic, or it may be that social conditioning can overcome them. You'd need accurate data from actual battlefield conditions to see what happens. But my guess is that those instincts are basically impossible to override. And if we can't override them for gender, it's not an absurd proposition that we might not be able to overcome them by race. I am half Scottish and half Indian. A few times I've got to hang out with other people that are half Scottish and half Indian, and it's weird. There's just this very deep sense of ooh, we're just the same. And that feeling, because I have it so rarely, sticks out as being remarkable. But if you go to someplace like Finland, I bet they're all feeling that way all the time. Oh, we're all just the same. Isn't this nice? Ooh, we're all just the same. Ooh. Now, is that racism? Right? The fact that I feel a sense of kind of comfortable familiarity with people that are half Scottish and half Indian, that it all sort of makes sense to me. is quite strange, right? It's a weird thing. It's certainly not happening at a rational level. So is there some genetic calculus that is just kind of looking at the whole thing and measuring stuff and telling me how to feel? Maybe so. This doesn't excuse structural and institutional racism, but I think we have to make a distinction here between the racism that you can measure inside of organizational decision-making and the racism that is weird personal preferences that I think trying to stamp that out is just very, very difficult. I'm sure education goes part of the way. I'm sure experience goes part of the way. It may be easier to break down than we expect. Like New York. Is race still the same thing that it was 50 years ago in New York, or are they evolving a post-racial thing? Singapore has enormous amounts of marriage between different ethnic groups, and it's quickly building a Singaporean ethnic identity that is definitely not any one of the original inputs. So, I'm willing to be guided by the data on this stuff. We could look at the places where race is breaking down, and we could look at the places where race is not, and we could make distinctions about how people have done this stuff. Like Japan, right? Japan has a culture which enormously supports the idea of inherent Japanese specialness. It's probably going to take a lot longer to break down in Japan than it is in, for example, Singapore. But I'm not sure that it matters that much, to be honest. I think the real damage that people take is from the institutional structural racism, where it's, well, can you get the loan? Can you get the university place? Can you get the job? And because we've got statistical analysis of those decision-making environments, we can detect the racism and we can fix it. In people's personal lives, how do you objectively tell whether somebody is racist or whether they just don't like you, right?
Right.
Very, very difficult. And I think spending too much time on personal racism while we still have institutional racism is a structural mistake, right? We can go to the places you can measure the problem and we can fix the problem. In the places where we can't measure the problem, how do you prove it? Very, very, very tricky.
And then there's this other element of where we are today in terms of surveillance. So surveillance becoming a kind of new class-based, culture-based, race-based tool. So the more privileged you are, the less you're watched.
Yeah.
The more freedom you have, the easier it is to pass through borders.
Yes.
This kind of thing.
Well, rich people tend not to steal things. Unless it's countries at times.
I was going to say.
But with all of this, the world is not fair, and it's not getting any fairer. Right? It's getting better, but it's not getting fairer. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. You can still have a world in which almost everybody has a reasonable quality of life, but the ultra-rich will continue to be massively ahead of everybody else. And I think that that is the most credible world that we could create. I think attempting to fix inequality between the richest and the poorest is basically impossible in our current culture. But we could make sure that none of the poorest die of preventable disease. We could make sure that none of the poorest die of starvation. We could raise the floor of humanity to a level that nobody would fall below with far less effort than we could make even small changes to fundamental economic inequality. So my preference is that the progressive cause is reframed as we fix the living conditions of the poorest and we let the rest of them get on with it. I think equality is a total red herring because it allows the middle class to feel pain that they are not the ultra-rich, and it also allows them to ignore all the people that are poorer than they are. It's the wrong form of engagement. We need to put the attention and the energy not on the fact that the middle class are not the ultra-rich, but on the fact that the poor people are having to do without wheelchairs. We could put the attention and the energy on where the real damage is being done in the society rather than latching onto the inequality narrative. Because I think that inequality as a narrative has some horrendous problems. What do you do about people that are just damn lucky? Oh, they're doing so well. Well, that's because they always seem to be in the right place at the right time. Well, what are we going to do? Tax them? Right? It's very, very, very hard to build an equality narrative that is not at some level intellectually absurd. And that's a completely different thing from talking about a poverty narrative where we can say, look, why in a world this rich does this person not have a wheelchair? This is crazy. We should just fix that. Everybody put something into the bucket, we're going to fix that. And that approach of just minimum standard of living that you cannot fall below, it's so much easier as a political dialogue. And that's something you can really get people behind, right? Everybody in the UK should have an income of 100 quid a week. We will pay it to everybody under all conditions all the time. In the event that you are making more money than that because you have a job, we will get it back off you as income tax. Problem solved. There is no more dole. right? And you could just do that and you could fix it. And then you wouldn't get homeless people who have no food because they'd have 100 quid a week to play with, and that is enough to eat. It might not be enough to get you a place to live in London, but it's enough to find you a place to live in, the back end of Yorkshire. We could do this. The numbers work. It's not very complicated. It gets rid of this constant problem of people getting kicked off their benefits because some piece of paperwork went wrong, because there is no benefits system that means tests for that basic income. Everybody gets it. It doesn't need to be £5,000 a month, right? Enough that people don't starve, on the streets, enough that people don't have to beg to eat. We could really do that, and it doesn't have to be means tested. We've already got the mechanisms to claim it back in taxation. You just record it as income for the people that are middle class. It's not that difficult. And it's our unwillingness to put the attention on fixing absolute poverty that causes the confusion about how are we going to run our welfare state. Right? Separate problems.
But when you say it's our unwillingness, I mean, I know a lot of people that massively support a universal basic income. Mm-hmm. How do we actually get that into play?
I think the consensus is that the old left is dead. Right? The unions are gone because labour is gone, because so much work was put into breaking the unions. So the next round of reorganisation of the left is probably going to be around basic income. If we're lucky, it will be around basic income rather than around economic inequality, because basic income you can do and economic inequality you probably can't. And I'd rather see a successful left than a failed left. In the same way I would rather see a successful right than a failed right. Right? The branch of the right wing that is entirely about independence, personal liberty, personal accountability, free speech, resistance to encroaching government power and all the rest of that, that part of the right wing needs to win. In the same way that the part of the left wing, which says nobody should go without a wheelchair if they need one, needs to win. There are good agendas on both the left and the right. The problem is there's also a bunch of garbage on the left and the right. Right? You get incredible hatred of people that are fortunate on the left in a way that is completely irrational. On the right, you get enormous amounts of racism, hatred of the poor. All of that stuff you need to basically just block. Try and stop it getting to the real world. Try and contain the problem. On the other side of the fence, it's not that you need a synthetic politics that combines the left and the right. I think that's not the real approach. But you need the competition between the left and the right to take out the bad ideas and only leave the best of each tradition in play. And I think that is the sort of politics that I'd like to see. It's a politics where you're very consciously using the competition between the various teams to focus the energy on the stuff that needs to get done. And that is not an easy approach. But if we don't do something along those kind of lines, we're going to be stuck with increasingly destructive competition between these different political forms, and we're not going to get any real progress.
And is this something that the technology can help us to do?
Okay, so how do you fix democracy? Right, I have a proposal for a really comprehensive overhaul of the democratic process that we have in the UK that requires almost no actual change. Right, the proposal is this. Instead of re-electing all of the MPs once every 4 years, we re-elect one MP every 4 days. Right? And you just have a constant running election where you have a calendar and it tells you when each borough will be re-elected. And if somebody quits as an MP or dies or something along these kinds of lines, if there's a forced election in that borough, you just do 2 that week. Or something along those lines, right? You fiddle with the details. But what that gives you is a continuous process where politics is happening all the time, and you don't get these crazy, sudden changes of national direction. If it's accepted that the ruling party is making a mess, over the course of a year, gradually they lose MPs until they get to the point where they can no longer govern, and you get a smooth transfer of power. And I think that systems along those lines, you would likely wind up with cabinets that contained members of all parties, simply because it made the drifting of power from one side to the other much easier to manage if you already had a few people in government. Mm-hmm. And you could move from something that was this pitched battle once every 4 years to a continual shifting of tensions and allegiances. And it doesn't change the structure of our democracy at all. It's literally a tiny little bureaucratic reorganisation of how we do things. It doesn't change the principle of first past the post. It doesn't change the districting. It doesn't change the party system. It's a small shift.
But it is a big shift in the power structure.
Yeah, sure. Right.
And so how does something like that happen?
Well, the thing is, it's probably not going to happen, right? You can talk about the ideas, you can wait, you can see what happens. In times of crisis, new things often get done in a bit of a hurry. Sometimes these crazy ideas actually get implemented, but it just goes to show that there are radical proposals that don't require shifting the principles, they just require shifting the implementation methods. And any kind of technological intervention in the democratic processes is far more likely to succeed if you're just shifting the implementation methods than if you're attempting to shift the democratic principle. We should have shifted the democratic principle at every new round of technology that went into democracy, right? Once you had the invention of radio, telegraph, television, the internet, every one of those things should have updated the machinery of democracy a little bit. Instead, we just decided that putting an X on paper every 4 years was the last and final and perfect form of democracy, and that was where we were going to leave it. That was a mistake, right? We should have been much more proactive in small incremental technological innovation one at a time. Now we've got hundreds of years of democratic technology backlog, but I don't think we're going to get that updated anytime soon. Maybe small countries will get on that bandwagon, like Estonia. You can just about imagine Estonia deciding that it was going to do some kind of ultra-modern post-internet governance model. You can just about imagine they'd give it a try. If it was hugely successful, other countries might copy them. And I think that's how we will get change at those levels. But the large industrial democracies, it works well enough that you'd be very scared to tinker with it. It's not that bad. It's bad, but it's not that bad. And it could be a lot worse. And very small changes could have very unexpected effects. So I think, small country experimentation, large country conservatism is not that bad a way of looking at it.
And so for our friends that are listening, where do they put their energy? Where do they put their resource?
So a lot of it depends on what kind of resource they have. This is a much harder question than it looks like, because we sort of assume that there's a single sort of best path for people as a whole. Like, everybody should be kind. Well, maybe, but what if your job is to fight? It's pretty hard to fight and be kind at the same time. Maybe some people should be really effective at being angry. There's a diversity of approaches that may be required to get the world to behave the way we want it to behave. To get a better world, it might require genuine diversity. Rather than this kind of, again, we come back to the American folk Buddhism model, where they've got a single template for what a good human being looks like. Maybe we need to break that down and allow a diversity of strategies. A diversity of personality types, all of which can be regarded as having utility and having objective value. Rather than the idea that you should become, peaceful and kind and creative and friendly and all the rest of these things. If everybody was the same way, things would be better. Well, maybe not. Maybe you need people that are obsessively detail-oriented and love catching other people and making mistakes and being dishonest. Maybe you need people that are incredibly showboaty and charismatic and stand in front of crowds and make big happy noises. Maybe you need a genuine mix. So the first piece of general advice I'd give to people is this. Almost everybody is lying about the nature of the problem, right? Doesn't matter what the problem is. In almost all cases where somebody frames a problem and asks for support, they're lying about the nature of the problem to make the problem into a problem which fits inside of a container which shiny, happy people are willing to deal with. So,
yeah, I'm doing that with this podcast. I called it The Future is Beautiful.
Yeah.
Which I know is, a question,
you hope it to
lie,
be, right? You hope it to be true, right?
Or not. I maybe just chose that as the name to invite people in.
Maybe it's the aspiration you have, right? Maybe that's what you're working towards, right? There's some value to a declaration. But, understanding the social dynamics of how we form political consensus, super important. So we take a horrendous problem like homelessness, right? We then take this notional kind person, a nice person, a good person, right? And we basically fit the story to be something that our archetypal helper person will react to as something they can touch. So if we look at homelessness, we don't focus on homelessness and mental illness, which is where most of the action is. We focus at risk youth. Right? Here is the least socially unexpected story about homelessness. Now we want you to give us resources to go and fix homelessness. But if we raise money for dealing with at-risk youth, we're only going to solve the at-risk youth part of the homelessness problem. And we're still going to wind up with a bunch of schizophrenic veterans kicking around on the streets because they got broken in the wars and can't function in society anymore. Right? So the first thing that we have to resist is the simplification of the problems into a socially acceptable form. The reason that things are problems is because they're not socially acceptable. Right? What is the problem with large-scale consumption of meat? Well, there are environmental issues, but there's also the cow murder, right? The abattoir thing. I mean, I eat meat, right? I eat meat because if I stop eating meat, I stop caring. The world just fades into this kind of blissful, calm, happy, serene watching of the river of life go by, and I find it almost impossible to generate the will to engage.
Seriously?
Seriously. I very, very, very carefully have to limit my spiritual practice and do very, very hardcore grounding activities, or I revert to the mean for somebody that's done the kind of meditation that I did.
Yeah.
I expected to spend my life as a meditation teacher. I trained for it until I was 30. That was what I was going to do with my career. And then I got pushed off into doing energy policy and defense planning and all the rest of this stuff to try and intervene in the processes of reducing war. You, Gupta, go and do something about the war problem. The meditation teaching thing, this is going to have to wait. Go and do something about the war problem. This is your job now. Go and do. Oh, right? And getting into a position where I care enough about politics to have an opinion. You know what meditation teachers are like. Oh, yes, the world is very complicated. That's why you come to the ashram where everything is simple and you can just let it all go. The eternal truth is more important than the munchkinning out there. Oh, ignore the chimp thing. That is the default to which I would normally resort.
Yeah.
So I eat meat because it's one of the things that brings the consciousness down to the point where I have an opinion. Very hard, very hard. Terrible ethical problems. What do you do?
Yeah. I have a bit of scotch to do that.
See, there we go.
Yeah. After being very sober and very kind of in my practices, and then realizing that was pulling me away from the activism, the being awake, and then realizing that we need to bring these inner and outer worlds together. So I've had to just relax a little bit, and if it's a glass of scotch here and there or whatever it is, I haven't gone to meat. No,
can't get near the meat thing. Yeah, well.
But I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, in emergency.
I sometimes feel that it would also help some physical strength, because you have to be a bit more careful when you're a vegetarian.
Yeah. Do you have an electric pressure cooker? The electric pressure cooker, this thing they call Instant Pot, is completely life-changing for vegetarians.
Okay.
Because you can go from 2 handfuls of dried chickpeas to actual food in 40 minutes with no planning. So it means you could get the high-quality dry proteins very, very, very quickly. It just makes being vegetarian super convenient in a way that it just normally isn't, because it takes out the long simmering time for the dried pulses. It's really good. It's dramatic how much easier it makes being vegetarian. Because we used to feed a lot of people at the house, and we still do sometimes. And your kind of 2 choices are meat in the oven or beans in the machine. And so we got very good at the instant vegetarian curry. Boom, food. Anyway, I want to go back to what people should do.
So far we've got eat meat, drink scotch, get an instant.
It's very easy,
instant pot for your cooking.
So the thing about understanding the real problems is extremely important, right? So the real problems, you have to take the story about what the problem is, the official narrative of the problem. Homelessness is about at-risk youth. It's the official narrative of homelessness. The truth, as far as I can tell, is that homelessness is largely about mental illness, right? The fix might be the same in both cases, but we mischaracterize the problem. We think about famines. What is it that causes famines? Oh, it's food supply problems. Usually it's political violence, right? Cutting off the food supply to a region which is in some kind of insurrectionary state is a way of bringing them back under control. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. The famous story about Live Aid, they finally sent all the food to the country and they let it rot on the docks because they weren't going to send the food to the rebels.
Wow.
My understanding of the Live Aid story is that very few people actually got fed. But a lot of people felt like they'd done something. Right? So clearly stepping outside of the official frame on the problems, understanding what the problem is. Global warming is about mass starvation. It doesn't matter at all if, Scotland is 3 degrees warmer. It's irrelevant. It makes things a little nicer. It matters quite a bit if the temperature in central India goes from 35 degrees to 50 degrees in the middle of summer. That's a real problem. But it really, really matters if you get a drought and agricultural collapses across the subsistence agriculture belts in Africa. Now you've got a real problem. Hundreds of millions of people with no food and no money. Whoa, now what? Right? So those sorts of narrations of the problem, if everybody understood that the real damage from global warming is going to be mass starvation, it's so much easier to characterize why we need to do something about this. All these people are directly dependent on the food that they grow with their own hands, and we're breaking nature so nothing will come out of the ground because it will be dry baked earth and they will starve. We need to do something about the oil burning. Right? Well, yeah, your coastal cities will flood and you'll get some big storms, but you'll also get nicer weather. You know, a lot of people, if global warming wasn't about subsistence agriculture and starvation, you could sort of make an argument it wasn't that high a priority. What makes it a priority is that it's going to break ag. If it breaks the food system, we're really going to feel it. Even the rich will feel it in those scenarios. Clear problem statement. Thing one, when somebody gives you a story about what the problem is, it's not about gorilla habitat, it's about whether millions and millions and millions of people starve. Right? You always have to go back to the source material to understand why the problem is the problem, because if we give people, anytime somebody sells you the socially acceptable face of a problem, there's a completely socially unacceptable face of the problem a little further back in the story. Every time somebody gives you that story, further back in, there's a much worse story. You have to get to that story before you understand what's happening. The whole kind of female circumcision thing, right? They found the least scary way of talking about what was happening and then tried to sell people that it was a bad idea, right? If you dig under the surface of that story, what's happening is so incredibly horrific, you really wonder why they haven't done like mass-scale human rights prosecutions. Like, seriously terrible things are being done here. And, you pry the lid off to get to the truth, right? In America, they talk about segregation. What they really mean was apartheid. Then you look at the way that black people were actually treated in America while they lived under the American apartheid. You look at the genocide of the Native Americans. The actual stories are so much worse than, a bunch of Canadian guys in lumberjack jackets want more control of their traditional tribal lands. It's like, yeah, they're like 4% of the remaining population. What happened to the rest of them? You really don't want to know. The stories are much worse than we think they are. Right? And you say, oh, but people will overwhelm, and then if they get overwhelmed, they're going to change their lives. And if they change their lives because they can't cope with the world as it is, they're either going to go in or they're going to go out. If they go in, they develop the ability to more deeply understand themselves and the world around them and why they're overwhelmed. If they go out, you get an entirely tougher, more forceful variety of activists. Right? So we have to step out of the idea that the problems need to be dumbed down to the point where they fit inside of an American folk Buddhism solution framework. And we need to deal with the idea that the solution frameworks require a huge diversity of personal responses and that the problems are, generally speaking, not solvable by niceness. There's a breaking of the frame which is necessary there, and it has to be done with enormous force. Because we've had 50 years of hippie good vibe activism. It hasn't solved a single problem. They're all still there, and most of them are worse than they ever were. So we break the hippie good vibe activism, we throw out the American folk Buddhism, we go back to the intellectual tradition of the West, we go back to authentication spirituality, we go back to looking at the problems as they really are rather than trying to dumb them down to the point where you think you can solve it by being nice. This is advice number one. Right? Got it. Second thing is fortunately a heck of a lot easier, which is stop pretending that structural problems are about personal choices. Right? There's been an enormous pressure in society to pretend that the environmental problem is a series of personal choices, and if everybody does a little bit more recycling, eats a little bit less beef, everything will get better. Generally speaking, individual behaviour is that people do whatever is most convenient, and if you want to change the world, you have to change what's most convenient by changing the law to take the bad option off the table. So we should stop wasting our time on cultural change, and we could really seriously strap in an arm to the teeth for legal challenge. Right? Front line of defence for almost all of the causes that matter should be lawyers. It should be litigation-led, it should be lobbying-led, it should be power-led. Right? Mass consciousness change to the point where nobody eats meat, hard. clearing all the regulatory obstacles to biotech, solving the meat problem, way more likely to be effective, and the industry will pay for it. Right? My advice to everybody right now that's looking for a career where they can change the world in a really meaningful way is get into the clean meat business and figure out how to get that stuff adopted and scaled. Right? It's going to be such a cultural battleground. When the Daily Mail questions whether clean meat is really meat, if you wind up with a government that bans it, oh no, we've come to the conclusion we have to protect agriculture and the traditional British lifestyle, so we're not going to let this clean meat thing happen. Those are fights where if we get in there early and we figure out what's going on and we win, we really change the world. Right? And those are fights where people can come in from a variety of different ethical positions. Some of them are animal rights people, some of them are climate change people, some of them are, science people, business people. You can put all of those people together and you can go out there and you can do the legislative agenda, you can do the cultural agenda, you can get the technology adopted. And that sort of an approach, that's a very different kind of activism. Right? Yes, some of it is about changing individual consumer behaviour, but the vast majority of it is about legislation and lobbying. And that understanding that we've taken a huge range of fundamental structural problems in society and we've pushed them back onto the individual as if the individual had any power, that's not by chance. Right? Industry groups worked really hard to frame the environmental problem as being about consumer choice rather than being about legislation. Well, it turns out it's about legislation to a very large degree. It's about technology and legislation to force the adoption of the technology. So again, you break the idea that the kind of American Buddhist, a third-rate bodhisattva archetype. It's like, well, we just all need to change the way that we think. It's all about consciousness change. No, it's about law change. Right? Don't change consciousness, change the law.
So I'm with you on the law change, but can't we change both at the same time? Isn't there an energetic impact of millions of people eating less meat? Of course, that's not going to change it in the same way that legislation will, but isn't there an energetic impact of that?
Well, you're an Indian, I presume.
I am,
right?
Yes.
From some part of the tradition that does intense spiritual practices. I've got some recollection. You're Sikh, maybe?
Half Jain, half Hindu.
Oh, there we go, right? So in that kind of context, right, there is no doubt at all that to get anywhere, you do a lot of work. Right? Lot of work. Thousands of hours of work.
And in Jainism, you make a lot of sacrifice in particular.
Yeah.
Lifestyle sacrifice is a huge part of it.
Serious business. If there was an easier way of doing it, that's what our ancestors would have done. So, yes, there's a lot of opportunity for transformation of consciousness to make the world work the way we want it to work. There's a huge amount of room for that to be the way things are. But, ... effort at less than that level is, generally speaking, almost completely wasted. Right? It didn't get easier just because Europeans and Americans were doing it. And they're not doing enough of it for it to work. When people come to me and say, meditation, I say, right, hour a day for 6 months, right? Then come back and tell me whether you like what it did. And if it did, we can discuss a real practice schedule. And that's about realistic, right? I got where I am because I did more than an hour a day for 8 or 9 years with basically no progress. And then I got kicked into a completely different universe. All at once, overnight. Boom. Whoa. Wow. Amazing. Now what do I do? Then I went off to find a guru. So, those kinds of processes, that's about how hard you got to work to get things to move. Right? I don't see anybody talking about evolution of consciousness talking about that kind of level of effort. Again, I hate to keep harping on this as if it's the core of all evil, but I really think it's the biggest single problem we have. The American folk Buddhism model is that you can do 15 minutes twice a day and gradually you'll turn into a better person. This doesn't really work. It might make you slightly more efficient, it might make you slightly less stressed, but in no way does this constitute fundamental evolution of consciousness. Fundamental evolution of consciousness, I say to people, look, it's a PhD's worth of work, assuming that you're starting from high school. That's the level of effort required, and at the end of that, you ought to be an enlightened being. Right? Maybe it'll be harder if you turn out not to be very diligent, maybe it'll be a little easier if you've got some pre-existing mental training, But generally speaking, you're looking at a decade of your life in which this is the primary activity if you're going to actually take a decent crack at becoming enlightened. Yes or no, are you in or not? Very few people are prepared for that level of effort. So why do we think that, conscious evolution of consciousness is going to be effective?
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you, so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. I suppose my question or my hope is that we hold the bigger picture and we work towards the bigger picture, but we're diligent about the small steps underneath too.
Yes. What I don't want to give people is the illusion that the sum of many small actions is one large action.
And I hear that, but I feel like what I'm saying is that it's about the discipline.
The discipline for the people that are proper spiritual practitioners is more or less all that counts, right? I mean, actually just getting it right is more or less the whole of the law. The precision of action is required, and if you don't have it, there's just no point showing up. So in that sort of setting, most people are not able to hold that level of precision in their personal decision-making. They get dragged around a lot by culture, they get dragged around a lot by their families, they get dragged around a lot by the expectations of their friends. It's very, very hard for them to make the necessary steps to get things precisely right. And if they do, it often severely damages their cultural power. Right? So if it was well understood, and here, I'm putting on my traditional Hindu hat for a moment, right? This is not the hat I wear all the time, but just for the sake of argument, right? So if it was well understood that more or less everybody who was doing yoga practices was either monogamous or celibate, how much less popular would yoga be? Right? Traditional culture, anybody that's doing heavy yoga is going to be monogamous or celibate. That's more or less universal. Right? So you then break this notion that yoga is a thing that makes you have a really fit, hot body, which you can then take to nightclubs.
Yeah.
Right?
Or in my experience, where celibacy has come in without me wanting it to.
Right.
Willingly.
The losing of interest.
Well, I don't know. The practices are stronger than the will, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just about what shows up, what doesn't show up. Yeah. Once you're walking a certain path. Yeah. And then the amount of neo-tantra events I get invited to.
We can't talk about tantra. We can't talk about tantra.
But just throw that in so that you
we can't talk
make that face.
Do we have to talk about tantra?
No, let's skip through this. But where I want to get to with this is if you take away the spirituality part of it, that this is how I feel. That even though I know that if we all recycle, we're not really getting to the problem. Mm-hmm. I feel that there is a thing about values-based living where you separate your recycling anyway, rather than just carelessly throwing it into the bin.
So this is very Gandhian.
That energetic action, even though that isn't what's going to change everything, is still important because it's part of integrity.
Yes. Right, yes. So, yes, I absolutely agree, but almost no one has any integrity.
Vinay, can't we even have integrity today?
How long did it take you to develop integrity?
It comes and goes.
Right? How much effort? Right?
Yeah.
So, in the Indian cultures, right, there is an understanding that everybody should do a little and a few people should do a lot in terms of spirituality. Right?
Yeah.
Now, you and I are of the demographic, we're the few people that do a lot. Right? That thing, the identity of being the few people that do a lot, there's a ladder of difficult things that you do that lead you to be the kind of person that can actually get it right when it counts. Right? That path is a professional career development path. Right? It's like becoming a brain surgeon. Right? And it really is like becoming a brain surgeon. Right? You're going to be dealing with people at the most intimate level of their psyches in the most careful possible way to change the fate of their entire families in many cases. If you can talk to somebody about why they're alcoholic and make them stop drinking, it's psychic surgery. It's a rearrangement of the entire psyche. And that kind of capability is what the vast majority of the Indian spiritual practices are meant to lead to. You're meant to become a person that can help people when they're sick in the soul, or help a culture when it's sick in the decisions. So for the people that are on that professional development path, it makes a whole bunch of sense to go climb these hard ladders because they make you a better person at that level of function. The question is, what about everybody else, right? Is a sort of spiritual first aid training really worth putting people through where they can get the very basic stuff right most of the time? Or are we better focusing the attention on political change and legal change? And the kind of folk Buddhism approach has been very, very, very strong on the idea that you do kind of spiritual first aid training for everybody and eventually you evolve them forward. But for the most part, what I see is that you give them the spiritual first aid training and then they basically figure out that they can drink the hand sanitizer. Right? Yeah. It's generally not working. I remember being at a kirtan, the Hindu singing thing, where, kirtan, Jiva Mukti Yoga in New York. Can't remember who it was. It was somebody pretty decent. And I noticed that in the yoga studio, they have showers with frosted glass doors on a public hallway. And I'm like, you have a yoga studio in which you have showers which are basically intended to show off people's naked bodies in the yoga studio. And you sort of look at this like, I don't know whether to be impressed or appalled. And mostly I was appalled. Like, the total mutation of the tradition into something that served the agendas of the local culture, unbelievable. Right?
I like that you were slightly impressed whilst being mostly appalled.
Well, they're really going for it. And this gets into, God, I hate to even use the T word, right? But there is a question about what is the relationship between Tantra and birth control and modernity, right? If they had had birth control and barrier contraception in India 6,000 years ago, I doubt we would be so hung up on monogamy, right? So you can make an argument that there is an overhaul of the tradition for contact with the modern world, but I am not of the generation that's going to figure that out. I'm of the generation which is going to stare at the problem and do nothing. Right? The hard part about this, well, let me give a specific technical example. So almost nobody in the West doing Hatha Yoga does any pranayama. Right? They just don't do the breathing stuff. So what do we know about Hatha Yoga? It transforms the energy of the body from being heavy and dense to being energetic and powerful, right? Tamas to rajas. Note my terrible pronunciation. I know what the words mean, but I can't pronounce them. So, tamas to rajas, that's what you get from the stretchy bendy stuff. Then, rajas to sattvas, that's what you get from the breathing stuff. Mm-hmm. So what you have is all these, yoga bunnies that are running around doing prodigious amounts of hatha yoga and no pranayama. So they fill with rajas, they fill with energy and passion and strength, and then they run around in this supercharged position, just chewing on things. I don't get tired. I hardly sleep. I eat vegetarian food. I'm higher than a kite. I don't do any breathing exercises, but I'm filled with uncontrollable emotions. Wow! And you see tons of this. Right? Yeah. And it's just because they're doing the practice that generates the energy and not the practice that turns the energy into consciousness. Are they ever going to get around to it? Or is Western culture specifically impressing people with the idea that they're filled with energy because it's a culture in which energy is equated with goodness? Right? They're just taking the bits out of the tradition that solve the problem that they have. Oh, I wish I was hotter, and I wish I was more energetically strong, and I wish I could charge around the world like my big sister does. I wish I had confidence and strength, blah, 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 blah. And off they go. Right? They're really, 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 really just cherry picking the bits that they can use for their own pre-existing agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We thought they were learning to be like us. No. They're just learning to be better versions of them.
Is there an us and a them?
Sure. Right? We come from cultures in which the only technology that we had was social organization. So if you go back to the kind of static period, right, from the settlement of agriculture through to the arrival of the Muslim colonists, there's very little technological change in India. There's a 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 year period in which nearly all innovation is social innovation and innovation in personality and character. The only thing that they can do to improve quality of life is to be better people, better organized. So the bedrock technology of Asia, and I think this is largely true in China, is better people, better organized. And that's what we had because we put our cultural energy into transforming our society because we didn't have science that allowed us to transform our physicality. Mm-hmm. In the West, they got the science that allows them to transform the physicality, so they never had the pressure to change the individual and to change the society. Very messy people, very messy societies. All of the energy goes into technological change, and it's incredibly powerful and also tremendously dangerous. Hence nuclear bombs and global warming. Mm-hmm. When they get it right, you get rid of smallpox. When they get it wrong, you wind up with Hiroshima. Right? These are not problems that we have because we did the majority of our social development in a time when we had no access to technologies with that kind of power. So the Asian approach is we generally look at the world as being about the quality of the people and the societies. Western approach is do the gadgets work? And it turns out, if you get the gadgets right, it almost doesn't matter how bad your society is. If you've got clean meat, solar panels, and the internet, it doesn't really matter that you are making every single wrong social decision you could make and that your relationships all look like hell on earth. Nonetheless, you will not be destroying the world and nobody will starve. Mm-hmm. You can actually use raw technological progress as a way of solving the problems of the world. It's incredibly messy, it's very dangerous, but it does seem to be working. And then the Asians basically have to look at this and decide, well, do we have anything to offer? Is it a fusion where we take the Western technologies and the Asian social development and we put them together, or do we basically just try and run our world our way and their world their way? And I'm stuck half and half on this because I'm half Asian and half white, and so I'm looking at this through the lens of my parents' expectations. They did things differently.
I mean, I'm stuck between worlds too. Both my parents are Indian, but I was born and brought up in England.
Yeah.
So I never know where I am.
Complicated culturally.
Right.
Very complicated culturally. Particularly if you do heavy spiritual practices, it tends to pull you much deeper into the Asian perspective, and then you wind up basically alienated inside your own culture. We used to call this the white women in saris problem. You know, they'd get very into their yoga and they'd discover they had to be as Indian as possible to get the stuff to make sense to them. And so you wound up with we never wound up with a genuinely authentic Western fusion Hinduism. We either wound up with serious devotees that tried to become as Hindu and as Asian as possible, or we wound up with glib Westerners that just picked the bits they liked and called it yoga. Right, I have now psychologically prepared myself to talk about Tantra. It took a while.
I don't know if I've psychologically prepared myself to hear about Tantra.
Okay, so I was trained as a Tantric, right? Mm-hmm. My teacher said, look, there are basically 4 and a bit major schools of Tantra, and they're defined by how they handle paternity, right? They're celibate, they're monogamous with the occasional exception, or they are tribal like the balls. Right? And as long as you understand that what separates the schools of Tantra is how they handle paternity, there is no ambiguity about what the rules of the game are. The rules of the game are defined by whether or not people are going to have kids. That's the frame. The second part of her explanation of Tantra is simply the intersection between enlightenment and responsibility. Mm-hmm. Right? If you are enlightened and you have a family, there's an interface between your absolute spiritual freedom and objectivity and the fact that your kid doesn't want to go to school that morning. And you're constantly riding that balance, the bicycle, between these two poles. Mm-hmm. Right? And those two facts together are basically all that anybody actually has to know about Tantra. Right? But what about all the, the stuff? Well, what about all the stuff, right? If you have freedom and you have responsibility,
then there will be a certain amount of stuff. People will want to get married. They will want to have kids. It's going to happen the same way it always did. Right? But the misunderstandings, remember what I said about hatha yoga? Right?
Yeah.
So you take an enormously sexualized culture with huge amounts of sexual repression and sexual guilt, and you offer them this kind of like, oh, would you like the magic license? Do anything you like in bed and pretend that it's getting you closer to God? Oh, you want the magic ticket? It turns out they want the magic ticket.
Yeah.
This is why I don't use the word tantra, right? I mean, if I'm teaching the material that would typically be in tantra, the phrase that I use is sorcery. Right? Hindu sorcery, Nepalese Hindu sorcery.
Because I say tantra, but then I say brackets, not the sexy stuff.
Yeah. I just can't use the term, right? Because nobody can differentiate, right? Nobody can distinguish.
And it's kind of that same thing that we're talking about with race or whatever it else, when something's so culturally understood that even if your intellect knows a different thing, your reactions still go whether...
I mean, anything that people think will get them laid, they're going to be interested in.
Okay, right. Just explain it that way.
There's just no way of getting around the fact that the association is that tantra equals sex.
Right.
And they've gotten that so deeply embedded in the culture. I mean, there was a point where I thought there was some point in fighting for the word, and I just gave up. Sorcery. Because when you explain to people, like, okay, so, my branch is the monogamous householder tantra branch, right? You get people together, they do the rituals, everybody goes home with their normative, ordinary, domestic partner, right? That's our tantra. That's not tantra.
Right.
Okay, let me get my shotgun. I'll come back. Now tell me it's not tantra again. Boom!
And that actually it's about the interception of the spiritual practices and the responsibility of the real world.
Yeah.
And it's really nothing to do with sex.
Well, it's also not nothing to do with sex. I mean, right, because the majority of the householder responsibility is about dealing with kids.
Right.
Right. So that, I mean, to me, the interface was always that I explained it in terms of it's enlightened people attempting to be householders with children.
Right.
And when you put the kids back into the Tantra story, the whole thing begins to make sense.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and again, right, I'm really harshing on Buddhism for some reason. The majority of the trouble in Tantra comes from Tibetan Buddhism, in which nobody's having kids. So the Dakini archetype, right, are these very hypersexualized female wisdom teachers that never have children. So there's no cycle of life stuff, there's no responsibility stuff. What you have is a monastic tradition with ritual sexual partners. And that basically sounds a lot to people like the Playboy Mansion. So you mean basically we have these women around and we can have sex with them and they never have children, we never have to take care of any kids? Ah, that sounds amazing. Right? Because what they're having is the sexuality with no responsibility.
Right.
And this is addictive, right? It's a drug, right? When you put this in the context of, Tantra is about forming stable domestic arrangements in which enlightened beings can raise children together, suddenly it doesn't sound so much fun.
No.
Like, oh, well, so there's sex. Well, yes, because people are married to each other, and that is typically one of the things that happens in marriages, particularly if they're going to have children. Oh, but what about all the other thing? Oh, you mean the orgies? Yeah, that's the Tibetans. That's not us. No, somebody else. Somebody else's department. Maybe the balls over there, right? They're a bunch of street yogis. They raise their children in big tribal units. You could join them and run away and give away all your worldly possessions, and then you could live as a mad beggar with small children. Oh, no, that wasn't what we had in mind. It's just... You see what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
So it's the decontextualization, right? If you break the psychological link between people having sex and people having kids, the whole thing just freewheels, and it's impossible to not misunderstand Tantra. Mm-hmm. It only makes sense when you put the kids back in the picture, because the interface, as you say, between the spirituality and the responsibility is largely around children. Mm-hmm. And that is not a message that goes over very well in the Neo-Tantra world, right? So how many of you guys are like having kids together and raising your children in intelligent spiritual households? None. Like literally none. And so at that point, in what way is the responsibility associated? It's not that they're forming teams to take on the load of producing a good spiritual environment for the next generation. They're not doing the heavy lifting.
Right. And as well as the role of parenting, which is very much a way of creating the next generation, bringing in responsibility, understanding how the world works, what the next steps are, actually understanding what are those moral codes of small everyday decision making, right? And you've got a kid asking you, why? But why? Mm-hmm. You have to find the right answers. And that's actually a deeply spiritual thing to do. It's a deeply activist thing to do. If you can find that place of those answers in a way that's actually going to shift us forward as humanity, rather than the because I told you so kind of answers that can be a default.
Absolutely.
But it's the responsibility is not just parenting, but it is that responsibility of parenting the world.
It's like parent as first guru.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if you are not going to have children, then you still have a responsibility as a parent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As an adult.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the tricky thing around, the easy explanation is that it's about kids, right? The hard explanation is it's about society. Mm-hmm. So the really slippery problem here is effective contraception and barrier birth control. So once you're in a position where you can make a decent argument that sex has been largely de-risked, right? Unwanted pregnancy doesn't happen, STTs don't happen. The question then is, what is the correct reaction of the old Asian cultures to that circumstance, right? Do we cling to social norms from the old days where these things weren't true, and so institutions like arranged marriage were obviously extremely sensible solutions? Or do you kind of take this step of re-engineering and figuring out how you're going to make that thing run? So in my case, I certainly cleave pretty closely to the traditional frameworks. And that was a point of extremely intense negotiation between me and my guru in like 95, 96, which resulted in a set of vows and, the whole rest of that thing. In that context, I'm not likely to do any heavy cultural innovation on that stuff. The problem I have is the handful of people for whom I'm teaching want to know what to do about their sex lives. Mm-hmm. But Vinay, what should we do about this? I'm like, well, basically I stuck pretty close to the Hindu arranged marriage framework. This is probably not going to work for you. And the question is, what do you tell them? What do you recommend? Unfortunately, most of them have wound up settling down and getting married. And at that point, it's no longer anything to do with my opinion, right? But, if I was going to teach at scale, you would need some kind of story about how all that stuff is to be approached. And I just don't have a good story. I don't know what I would tell people if they asked. Do you cling to an archaic model? Do you participate in the norms of your culture? Do you find some kind of mid-path through it? If I had 1,000 students rather than 4, how would you approach that question? Super tough. Super tough.
Well, we have landed somewhere different to where I imagined we would go today. And we're at time.
Splendid.
And so I would like to thank you for your well thought out solutions and your questions, your excellent questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, me too. And how do we find out more about what you're doing? Do you have a link that you can share?
Probably the best overview is a website called My Hope for the World, right? My Hope for the .world, which is a quick summary of the work that I did on disaster relief and then moves into the blockchain stuff. There might be a link there to some of the meditation stuff that I taught. If not, maybe I'll put one up. If you're interested specifically in the blockchain work, I run a company called Materium, which focuses on the implementation of legal property rights on blockchains. So basically, how do you make legal stuff happen on-chain? And that's me. That's what I do.
Great. And we'll post links to everything that we've mentioned in today's episode.
That'll be fun. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog, We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?